Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps the woman you just humiliated is the only person who can decide whether your company survives tomorrow. The words had not been spoken yet, but they were already hanging invisibly over the Grand Astoria ballroom like a storm no one could see coming. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors, while a string quartet floated through the air with effortless elegance. More than 200 executives, investors, politicians, and media personalities filled the room in tailored tuxedos and designer gowns, raising champagne glasses to what every business headline had already called the deal of the year. Cameras flashed every few seconds. Waiters moved with rehearsed precision between linen-covered tables worth more than most families earned in a month. At the center of it all stood Ethan Callaway, the 39-year-old CEO whose face had appeared on magazine covers often enough that people stopped asking whether he was successful and started asking how much more successful he could become. Tonight was supposed to be another victory. His technology company had spent 11 exhausting months negotiating with Whitmore Strategic Capital, a private investment group prepared to inject $1 billion into his expansion plans. Reporters whispered that the announcement would reshape the industry before sunrise. Ethan believed them. Confidence surrounded him like another tailored suit. Every handshake looked calculated. Every smile seemed practiced. Every conversation ended with someone laughing at exactly the right moment. Around him, executives competed for attention while assistants rushed to solve problems before anyone important noticed them. Then there was Naomi Brooks, 27 years old, black, quiet, wearing the same black and white service uniform as every other waitress in the ballroom. To most of the guests, she barely existed. They noticed the sparkling water appearing before they noticed the steady hands placing it there. They admired perfectly folded napkins without wondering who had folded them. Naomi had learned long ago that invisibility could be strangely educational. Invisible people heard everything. They noticed every careless joke, every impatient sigh, every dismissive glance exchanged between powerful people who assumed no one was paying attention. She moved calmly through the crowded ballroom, carrying a silver tray balanced with effortless grace, her posture composed despite hours on her feet. She smiled politely when spoken to and remained silent when ignored. There was nothing theatrical about her, nothing demanding attention. Yet her observant eyes quietly collected details others overlooked. Near the center table, Ethan accepted another congratulatory handshake, while several board members discussed how quickly the billion-dollar investment would multiply the company's value. Across the room, a wealthy socialite wearing an elegant ivory evening gown accepted a fresh glass of red wine without taking her attention away from an animated conversation. As Naomi approached to refill another guest's sparkling water, the woman turned abruptly. A sharp movement, a startled gasp. Deep crimson wine splashed across Naomi's white blouse and dark apron, drawing immediate attention from every nearby table. For one suspended heartbeat, the music seemed quieter. Conversations faded. Hundreds of eyes shifted toward the young waitress, standing perfectly still beneath the ballroom lights. Red wine slowly dripping onto the polished marble floor, while expensive laughter began spreading through the room like a ripple no one bothered to stop. Naomi did not gasp. She did not argue. She simply looked down at the dark red stain spreading across her uniform before lifting her eyes with the same calm expression she had worn all evening. Around her, expensive conversations resumed almost immediately, as though dignity could be cleaned as easily as a marble floor. A few guests exchanged awkward smiles, but most chose convenience over courage. They turned back to their champagne, their networking, and the promise of tomorrow's headlines. The woman holding the empty wine glass barely glanced at Naomi before waving one manicured hand dismissively. "Someone should clean this up," she said with a light laugh, as though she had merely dropped a napkin. Several people nearby chuckled politely, eager to remain on the right side of influence. Ethan Callaway watched the scene from less than 20 feet away. For a brief moment, his eyes met Naomi's. There was an opportunity, small but unmistakable, to step forward to ask if she was all right, to remind everyone that respect did not become less valuable inside a ballroom filled with billionaires. Instead, he adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and returned his attention to an investor discussing international expansion. The silence of a powerful person often speaks louder than words, and everyone close enough understood exactly what that silence meant. Naomi reached for a folded linen towel resting on her serving tray and gently pressed it against the front of her blouse. She thanked another server who quietly offered assistance, then gave a reassuring smile that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Her composure confused people more than anger ever could. She did not look defeated. She looked focused. As she walked toward the service hallway, whispers followed behind her like invisible footsteps. Some guests assumed she would be replaced before dessert. Others speculated that the hotel manager would compensate her with little more than an apology and a fresh uniform. No one wondered whether the evening might still revolve around the woman they had already dismissed. Inside the service corridor, the atmosphere changed completely. The music became distant. The polished glamour of the ballroom gave way to stainless steel counters, neatly stacked trays, and employees moving with quiet efficiency. A young dishwasher offered Naomi a clean towel. Another waitress asked if she wanted someone else to finish her tables. Naomi smiled warmly and shook her head. "I will be fine," she answered softly. "Thank you." She stepped into the employee lounge, carefully removed the stained apron, and looked at herself in the mirror. The red marks covered the front of her blouse, but they had not touched the quiet confidence in her eyes. She took a slow breath, checked the time on her watch, and glanced at a simple text message that had arrived only moments earlier. It contained just 5 words. "We are ready when you are." Naomi locked the phone, slipped it back into her pocket, and exhaled with remarkable calm. Outside the room, the ballroom continued celebrating a victory that had not yet happened. Waiters carried perfectly arranged plates. Reporters prepared cameras for the signing ceremony. Investors smiled for photographs, already imagining tomorrow's front pages. No one noticed that the countdown had quietly begun. In exactly 20 minutes, one signature would determine whether Ethan Callaway's company entered the next chapter of its history or watched $1 billion disappear through fingers that had mistaken status for character. The service hallway remained quiet, but the ballroom beyond its swinging doors grew louder with every passing minute. Laughter echoed beneath crystal chandeliers. Glasses clinked together in celebration. Somewhere inside, another photographer announced that everyone should gather closer because the official signing ceremony would begin shortly. Naomi Brooks listened for only a moment before fastening the top button of a fresh white blouse that had been pressed with almost military precision. She tied on another apron, not because she needed to keep serving tables, but because appearances still mattered. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room looked exactly like the one everyone ignored. She stepped back into the corridor with the same steady posture she had carried all evening. Every employee she passed greeted her with genuine respect. The hotel manager hurried toward her, concern written across his face. "Miss Brooks, I'm deeply sorry about what happened. We can arrange transportation if you would like to leave early." Naomi smiled politely. "Thank you, Daniel. I still have something important to finish tonight." Her answer was calm, almost ordinary, yet something about the confidence in her voice made him pause. Before he could ask another question, she continued walking toward the ballroom entrance. Meanwhile, Ethan Callaway stood beneath a towering arrangement of white orchids while answering questions from financial reporters. They asked about market projections, global expansion, and how quickly the company would scale after receiving the investment. Ethan spoke with polished certainty. He described innovation, leadership, and the future of American technology with the ease of someone accustomed to applause. Investors nodded approvingly. Every answer sounded prepared. Every statistic landed perfectly. Yet beneath the confidence, another emotion quietly grew stronger. Impatience. Whitmore Strategic Capital had still not introduced the final representative authorized to approve the investment. Contracts rested inside elegant leather folders on a nearby table, untouched. Several members of Ethan's executive team exchanged subtle glances. One leaned closer and whispered, "Do we know who is making the final decision?" Another quietly replied, "Only Eleanor Whitmore knows." Apparently, the board insisted on complete confidentiality. Ethan frowned almost imperceptibly. He disliked uncertainty. In business, hidden variables often became expensive surprises. Across the ballroom, Naomi resumed carrying an empty silver tray, blending once again into the rhythm of service. Guests barely acknowledged her existence. One executive absent-mindedly handed her an empty champagne flute without making eye contact. Another continued discussing stock prices as though she were invisible. Naomi accepted every glass with quiet professionalism, listening carefully as powerful people revealed more through casual conversation than they ever intended. She noticed who thanked the staff. She noticed who smiled. She noticed who never looked beyond expensive suits and polished shoes. Every small choice painted a clearer picture than any corporate mission statement ever could. Near the entrance, a large digital display began counting down to the scheduled announcement. 15 minutes remained. The elegant blue numbers glowed against a backdrop, displaying the logos of both companies waiting to become partners. Guests applauded as another speaker praised integrity, leadership, and shared values. The irony passed unnoticed by almost everyone in the room. Naomi glanced once toward the countdown clock before quietly checking the time on her watch. Perfect. Everything was unfolding. Exactly as expected. She adjusted the silver tray in her hands and continued moving through the crowd with measured grace, while somewhere beyond the ballroom doors, a black luxury sedan rolled to a silent stop beneath the hotel's grand entrance, carrying someone whose arrival would transform every smile, every assumption, and every certainty inside that magnificent room. The countdown on the towering display slipped from 15 minutes to 12, and the atmosphere inside the Grand Astoria ballroom grew noticeably sharper. Conversations became shorter. Smiles became more calculated. Every executive understood that fortunes were sometimes decided in the final few minutes before a signature touched paper. Ethan Calloway accepted another handshake while his legal counsel quietly reviewed the final contract one last time. Nothing appeared out of place. Every document had been approved. Every financial projection exceeded expectations. There was only one missing piece: the individual with the authority to authorize the investment. Eleanor Whitmore remained composed near the front of the ballroom, speaking politely with several senior investors while revealing absolutely nothing. Reporters attempted to ask who would deliver the final approval, but she answered every question with the same graceful smile. "You will all meet the decision-maker very soon." The mystery only fueled curiosity. Guests began making quiet guesses. Some believed a retired Wall Street legend was arriving. Others expected a famous technology founder or an influential politician. No one imagined the truth because no one had spent the evening looking beyond titles and expensive clothing. Naomi continued collecting empty glasses with unhurried precision. She moved through clusters of conversations like a quiet current flowing beneath the surface of a restless sea. A venture capitalist thanked her sincerely after accepting fresh, sparkling water. She answered with a warm smile. Moments later, another executive barely acknowledged her while handing over a used glass without interrupting his conversation. Naomi accepted both interactions with the same calm professionalism. Character often revealed itself in ordinary moments, not extraordinary ones. Near the center table, the same elegantly dressed socialite who had spilled wine earlier noticed Naomi returning to the ballroom in a clean uniform. She laughed softly toward two companions. "Well, that was fast. At least the hotel keeps plenty of replacements." The comment drifted across the table, followed by restrained laughter that sounded more nervous than amused. Naomi heard every word. She neither slowed her pace nor changed her expression. She simply continued serving another table as though the remark had dissolved into the music. Across the room, Ethan briefly glanced toward the exchange before looking away once again. His attention remained fixed on business. To him, The evening was about contracts, investors, and market value. Human moments seemed secondary to financial milestones. Yet every unnoticed choice quietly accumulated like invisible entries in a ledger no balance sheet could measure. The digital clock changed again. 10 minutes remained. A subtle ripple spread through the audience as the ballroom's grand entrance slowly opened. Several guests instinctively turned toward the doorway, expecting a dramatic arrival. Instead, two discreet security professionals entered first, followed by a distinguished older gentleman carrying a slim leather portfolio. They did not walk toward the stage. They stopped respectfully beside the entrance, as though waiting for someone else. Eleanor Whitmore immediately excused herself from her conversation and walked toward them with genuine warmth, something Ethan had not seen from her all evening. She checked her watch, smiled, and nodded once. "Right on time," she said quietly. The gentleman returned the smile, but did not move farther into the room. He simply looked across the ballroom until his eyes settled on Naomi Brooks. Without speaking a single word, he gave the smallest respectful nod. Naomi acknowledged it with an almost invisible smile before placing one final champagne flute onto her silver tray. Around her, no one noticed the silent exchange. The guests remained focused on the stage, the cameras, and the billion-dollar celebration they believed was only minutes away, completely unaware that the real decision had already begun long before anyone reached for a pen. The digital countdown reached 5 minutes, and the excitement inside the ballroom reached its highest point. Television cameras rolled into position while photographers adjusted their lenses toward the elegant stage where the signing ceremony would soon begin. Every guest seemed convinced they were about to witness another predictable victory for a celebrated chief executive. Ethan Calloway straightened his jacket one final time before exchanging confident smiles with members of his executive board. His chief financial officer quietly leaned closer and whispered that every market analyst expected the company's stock to surge as soon as the investment became official. Ethan nodded without hesitation. Success had become so familiar that certainty almost felt like a habit. Across the ballroom, Naomi Brooks gently placed her silver tray onto a service station near the entrance. She carefully folded the clean linen towel over one arm and thanked another waitress who offered to finish the remaining tables. "I appreciate it," Naomi replied with genuine warmth. "You have already helped enough." The younger waitress smiled, unaware that she was speaking to someone whose evening had never truly been about serving drinks. Naomi removed the small service glove she had worn throughout the gala and placed them neatly beside the tray. Every movement was calm, every gesture deliberate. She glanced once more toward the illuminated countdown clock. For minutes remained. Without attracting attention, she quietly stepped through a side corridor leading away from the ballroom. Most guests never noticed she had disappeared because they had rarely noticed her presence in the first place. Meanwhile, Eleanor Whitmore walked onto the stage and welcomed everyone for their patience. Her poised voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom as the conversations gradually faded into silence. She thanked the investors, the media, and the leadership team for an extraordinary evening before explaining that Whitmore Strategic Capital had always believed one principle: outweighed quarterly profits. "Character," she said with a gentle smile, "is the only investment that continues paying dividends long after financial returns are counted." Several guests applauded politely, assuming it was simply another polished corporate statement. Ethan smiled confidently and joined the applause without giving the words much thought. Behind the ballroom, Naomi entered a private executive suite where a tailored black suit waited on a garment rack beside a leather portfolio embossed with the discreet crest of Whitmore Strategic Capital. An experienced assistant greeted her with a respectful smile. "Everything is prepared, Miss Brooks." Naomi thanked her, exchanged the service uniform for the elegant suit, adjusted a simple silver watch on her wrist, and collected the portfolio from the table. There were no expensive diamonds, no dramatic jewelry, and no attempt to impress anyone through appearance alone. Quiet confidence required no decoration. Back inside the ballroom, the countdown reached 2 minutes. Guests leaned forward with anticipation while reporters prepared their microphones. Ethan noticed Eleanor glance toward the entrance once again, her expression shifting from professional composure to unmistakable satisfaction. Then the ballroom doors opened slowly. Every conversation stopped. Every camera turned. Every eye followed the figure walking through the entrance with calm, measured steps. Ethan expected to recognize another billionaire, another famous investor, another influential name from the financial world. Instead, his confident expression slowly disappeared as the woman he had watched serving champagne less than half an hour earlier entered the ballroom, wearing an impeccably tailored black suit, carrying the leather portfolio, and walking directly toward the stage while Eleanor Whitmore stepped forward to welcome her not as an employee, not as a guest, but with the unmistakable respect reserved for the one person whose decision everyone in that magnificent room had been waiting to hear. Silence arrived before anyone realized the music had stopped. The ballroom remained frozen as Naomi Brooks crossed the polished marble floor. With steady confidence, her measured footsteps echoing softly beneath the crystal chandeliers. Only 30 minutes earlier, many of the same guests had looked through her as though she were invisible. Now every pair of eyes followed her. Every whispered conversation disappeared. Every camera shifted away from Ethan Calloway and focused instead on the woman no one had bothered to know. Eleanor Whitmore welcomed Naomi with genuine respect and extended her hand. "Thank you for coming, Miss Brooks." Naomi returned the handshake with a warm smile before taking her place beside the presentation table. The distinguished gentleman who had entered earlier opened the leather portfolio and carefully placed several documents before her. He then stepped aside without saying another word. His role was not to lead the meeting. His responsibility was to support the person who would. Ethan remained motionless for a brief moment before forcing himself to smile. His years in corporate leadership had taught him how to recover from unexpected situations, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. He approached the stage and extended his hand politely. "It seems we have not been properly introduced." Naomi accepted the gesture with calm professionalism. "No, we have not." There was no bitterness in her voice. No satisfaction. Only quiet composure. Eleanor looked toward the audience before addressing the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, Whitmore Strategic Capital believes financial performance is only one measure of long-term success. Every major investment we make includes an independent leadership evaluation conducted without advance notice." Curious expressions spread throughout the audience. Reporters immediately began writing notes. Eleanor continued. "For the past 6 months, Naomi Brooks has served as the lead ethics consultant assigned to this investment review. She has attended company events, visited regional offices, interviewed employees anonymously, and observed leadership behavior without revealing her role. Tonight was the final stage of that evaluation." A wave of disbelief swept across the ballroom. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. The socialite, who had laughed at Naomi earlier, slowly lowered her eyes toward the floor. Ethan felt every confident assumption from the evening begin to collapse under the weight of a truth he had never considered. Naomi gently opened the portfolio and reviewed the final documents. Then she looked directly at Ethan. "Your company has extraordinary innovation. Your financial projections are impressive. Your management team is talented." Ethan allowed himself the smallest hopeful breath. Naomi continued before he could respond. "But leadership is revealed most clearly when there is nothing to gain from showing respect." The sentence landed with greater force than any public criticism could have achieved. No one interrupted. No one moved. Naomi calmly explained that the evaluation had never been limited to boardroom presentations or financial statements. It included how receptionists were treated, how maintenance staff were acknowledged, how restaurant employees were spoken to, and whether dignity remained consistent regardless of job title. She paused briefly before adding, "Character cannot be scheduled for a presentation. It appears in ordinary moments when people believe no one important is watching." Ethan lowered his eyes for the first time that evening. Around him, the applause that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier had been replaced by complete silence. The room had not changed because Naomi had gained power. The room had changed because everyone had finally discovered where the real authority had been standing all along. No one reached for a champagne glass anymore. The ballroom that had celebrated confidence only moments earlier now held something far heavier than disappointment. It held reflection. Ethan Calloway stood across from Naomi Brooks with the polished smile of a seasoned executive slowly giving way to honest uncertainty. For the first time that evening, he was no longer thinking about market value or shareholder expectations. He was replaying ordinary moments that had once seemed too insignificant to matter. A waitress standing quietly beside a table, a stained uniform, a chance to speak, a decision to remain silent. Naomi closed the portfolio. Without signing a single page, she did not rush the moment. She understood that some lessons became meaningful only when people were allowed to hear their own thoughts. Eleanor Whitmore remained beside her, saying nothing. The room no longer needed another speech. The truth had already spoken for itself. After several long seconds, Ethan finally broke the silence. "Miss Brooks, I owe you an apology." His voice was steady, but noticeably different from the confident tone he had carried throughout the evening. "Not because of this investment. Because I failed to recognize your dignity before I recognized your authority." Naomi looked at him with calm eyes that held neither anger nor triumph. "That distinction matters," she answered quietly. "Too many people believe respect is something earned through titles. It is not. Respect is the starting point, not the reward." Her words spread through the ballroom with remarkable clarity. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Even the reporters who had planned to write about a billion-dollar investment now realized they were witnessing a story that reached far beyond business. Naomi turned toward the audience. "During the past 6 months, I've visited your offices, your conferences, your community events, and your workplaces. I met engineers, receptionists, security officers, janitors, interns, assistants, and senior executives. Most of them treated every person with kindness regardless of position. Some did not. Leadership is never measured by how comfortably you sit in the boardroom. It is measured by how safely the least powerful person feels standing beside you." The ballroom remained completely still. The socialite who had dismissed Naomi earlier slowly stepped forward, her expression filled with genuine regret. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I behaved in a way that does not reflect the person I hope to become. I'm sincerely sorry." Naomi acknowledged her apology with a gentle nod. "Thank you. Growth always begins with honesty." There was no humiliation in her response, no public condemnation, only grace. Ethan watched the exchange carefully. He realized that the greatest display of strength he had witnessed all evening was not wealth, influence, or negotiation. It was restraint. Naomi could have embarrassed every person who had underestimated her, yet she chose something far more difficult. She offered each of them an opportunity to become better than they had been an hour earlier. Eleanor finally looked toward Naomi and asked the question everyone had been waiting to hear. "Based on your evaluation, are you prepared to make your recommendation?" Naomi rested one hand lightly on the closed portfolio before lifting her eyes toward Ethan one final time. "Before I answer," she said with quiet conviction, "I have one final question for the man who hopes to lead a company into its next chapter. If tomorrow every title in this room disappeared, every fortune vanished, and every person stood as equals, would they still choose to follow you?" The silence that followed felt longer than any applause the ballroom had ever known. The question settled over the ballroom with remarkable weight. No one reached for an answer because the question had not been asked of the audience. It belonged to Ethan Calloway alone. He looked across the room at the faces of his executives, investors, assistants, servers, photographers, and hotel employees. For the first time that evening, he noticed there was no difference between them except the roles they happened to hold. After several quiet seconds, he drew a slow breath. "Tonight," he said honestly, "I do not know." There was no excuse in his voice, no attempt to explain away what had happened. Only the uncomfortable clarity that accompanies genuine self-reflection. Naomi gave a small nod. "Thank you for answering truthfully. Honest leadership begins where perfect appearances end. Eleanor Whitmore watched the exchange with quiet approval before opening the final evaluation report resting inside the leather portfolio. The room remained completely silent as Naomi placed her signature on the last page of the assessment. Every camera focused on the movement of her pen. Every guest waited for the verdict they believed would either save or destroy a billion-dollar opportunity. Naomi closed the folder and looked directly at Ethan once more. Whitmore Strategic Capital will not make an investment decision based only on tonight. A wave of uncertainty swept across the audience. She continued before anyone could react. Character is not measured by one mistake. It is measured by the willingness to learn from it. Ethan listened without moving. Naomi gently rested one hand on the portfolio. Your company has extraordinary people. I met engineers who stayed late to help new employees without being asked. I met managers who knew the names of every member of their teams. I met security officers who treated visitors with genuine kindness. They deserve leadership that reflects the values they already practice every day. She paused briefly before delivering the conclusion every person in the ballroom would remember. Therefore, I am recommending that this investment be delayed for 90 days. A quiet gasp moved through the crowd. Naomi calmly continued. Not canceled, delayed. During those 90 days, your company will have the opportunity to implement measurable leadership reforms, strengthen employee culture, and demonstrate that respect is not a slogan reserved for annual reports, but a habit practiced every day. Ethan absorbed every word. Surprisingly, relief slowly replaced fear. The investment had not disappeared. Neither had the opportunity to become the leader he believed himself to be. Eleanor smiled slightly before addressing the audience. This recommendation is unanimous. She turned toward Ethan. We invest in companies with strong futures. We remain invested only in leaders willing to grow. Ethan stepped forward with quiet humility. You have my commitment. Not because I want the funding, because I should have led this way long before tonight. Naomi extended her hand once again. This time, Ethan accepted it with visible gratitude rather than professional confidence. Around them, applause slowly began to spread across the ballroom. It did not sound like the celebration planned for a successful business transaction. It sounded deeper than that. It was the recognition that the most valuable agreement reached that evening had never been written inside a contract. It had been written inside the conscience of a man who finally understood that lasting influence begins with ordinary acts of respect, especially toward those the world is most tempted to overlook. 90 days passed more quietly than anyone in the ballroom had expected. There were no dramatic headlines announcing instant transformation and no carefully staged publicity campaign promising a new corporate culture overnight. Instead, change appeared where it mattered most. Receptionists noticed that Ethan Calloway arrived early enough to greet employees by name. Security officers discovered that the chief executive now stopped to thank them before entering the building each morning. Interns found themselves invited to share ideas during meetings they had once only observed from the back of the room. Managers received new leadership training focused not only on performance, but on listening, accountability, and respect. Anonymous employee surveys became required reading for every executive. Promotions were no longer based solely on financial results, but also on how consistently leaders elevated the people around them. The changes seemed small when viewed individually, yet together they reshaped the atmosphere inside the company. People smiled more often. Conversations became more open. Departments that had once competed against one another began solving problems together. Word quietly spread that the company felt different. Customers noticed. Employees noticed. Even competitors noticed. Exactly 90 days after the gala, Whitmore Strategic Capital returned to the company's headquarters for the final review. This time there was no luxurious ballroom, no orchestra, and no television cameras waiting for dramatic moments. Naomi Brooks arrived through the front entrance carrying the same leather portfolio, dressed with the same quiet elegance, and wearing the same calm expression. The first person to greet her was the receptionist, who welcomed her warmly by name. Moments later, Ethan walked into the lobby, not surrounded by assistants or executives, but alone. He smiled sincerely and extended his hand. "Welcome back, Miss Brooks. I'm grateful you came." Naomi accepted the handshake and noticed something different immediately. It was not the words. It was the way every employee nearby continued working without fear, without forced enthusiasm, and without pretending. Respect no longer appeared to be a performance prepared for an important visitor. It had become routine. Throughout the afternoon, Naomi spoke with engineers, administrative assistants, custodians, customer service representatives, and new employees. Their stories were remarkably consistent. They described a leader who now listened before speaking, accepted responsibility without shifting blame, and regularly asked one simple question before major decisions. How will this affect the people who make this company possible? Late that afternoon, Naomi closed the portfolio for the final time and walked into the boardroom where Ethan and Eleanor Whitmore waited. She smiled gently before sliding the signed recommendation across the polished conference table. Eleanor opened the document, reviewed the final page, and nodded with unmistakable satisfaction. The recommendation is approved. No one cheered. No one celebrated wildly. The moment felt too meaningful for that. Ethan looked toward Naomi and quietly said, "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to become the leader I believed I already was." Naomi smiled warmly. "I did not change you. I simply gave you a chance to see yourself clearly." As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows overlooking the city, the agreement was signed at last. The investment would strengthen a growing company, but the greater victory had nothing to do with $1 billion. Wealth could build impressive buildings. Authority could command attention. Success could fill a ballroom. But only character could earn trust when no one was required to give it. And long after the contracts were filed away and the headlines were forgotten, one quiet truth continued to echo through every life touched by that extraordinary evening. Real power is never proven by the way you treat the most important person in the room. It is revealed by the way you treat the person everyone else forgets to see.